Show me the passenger car that's longer than a RAV4 with a wheelbase longer than a Land Cruiser and it's wider than a Hyundai IONIQ but 3 inches lower than a CX-5. Actually, I'll show you. Come on. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au and I get new cars cheap for buyers here in Australia. Website for that, obviously, or you can just click the card that's up there now, dude. A senior executive dude you've never heard of named Sangyup Lee, who is actually Vice President of Hyundai Global Design and, I imagine, a real hoot at dinner parties, said. This was the mission from the first day we began this project, to look ahead towards the horizon but stay fundamentally Hyundai. IONIQ 5 is the new definition of timeless, providing a common thread linking our past to the present and future. Actually, the past, present and future are already pretty robustly attached to one another, at least as I see it, so not too much need for any more temporal epoxy resin there, dude. However, I think you have smacked the fastener right on the cranium with that first bit. Good news is that after 8 to 12 months of deafening silence, IONIQ 5 orders will finally open in Australia to VIPs on October the 12th and to the general public the next day, the 13th. A $2,000 deposit is going to be required and orders will be taken online only. Delivery is slated for late this year and possibly early next because, as you know, everything automotive is up in the air right now. I got a couple of hours to climb all over a pre-production IONIQ 5 in between lockdowns, and I have to say it is pretty exciting to see the rapid evolution of the product in the metal. Don't forget, this is a ground-up EV with none of the fundamental engineering compromises inherent in jamming an electric powertrain into an established internal combustion platform. For this reason, IONIQ 5 should be awesome dynamically, and if it's not, someone's head should roll. And of course, as a result of this bespoke engineering, they've been able to rejig the vehicle's fundamental proportions. So the wheels are pumped right out into the corners and the wheelbase is roughly equivalent to that of a dual cab ute. There's no transmission tunnel, obviously, because no transmission. So inside, it's basically all free space. And I don't know if they've hit the sweet spot between looking futuristic enough and conservatism on the one hand versus looking like some awful prop on a B-grade Netflix sci-fi insomnia cure on the other. That's kind of two blondes versus brunettes for me to call. Take a closer look and decide for yourself. As clever as this car is, and it is pretty clever, I do wish they could do something with this sort of explosion in a cable factory and make it somewhat more elegant. I don't know what, but at least there is a so-called frunk in which to put it. That's particularly useful if you've got a whole bunch of stuff packed in the back and you don't want to unpack it every time you want to get to the standard charging cable. Now, let's talk batteries and powertrains and all of that stuff. There's two batteries, small and big, although frankly they're both pretty big, and if it was me I'd be ticking the box for the big one. And there's two powertrain options as well, which would be rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive, and the all-wheel drive one comes with a motor at each end, front and rear. And interestingly, if you tick the box for big battery and rear wheel drive, this will maximize your range. But I'd still be ticking the box for all-wheel drive, even though the range will come back, a little bit. Pricing is pretty sharp too. The first tranche of IONIQ 5s bound for Shitsville will be all high spec, and I don't know if they'll stick to convention and call them Highlanders, but that's what they'll be essentially. And they'll all have the big battery, which would be 72.6 kilowatt hours, or roughly 13% more than a Kona electric. According to the pricing that's just been announced, it's just under $72,000 for the two-wheel drive with the big battery, and just under $76,000 for the 5 with the motors at each end. So, to me, that's a complete no-brainer. I cannot think of a reason not to go for the all-wheel drive. Like, hey, if you've got 72,000 Shitsvillian micro pesos, I'm pretty sure you can stump up 76. And it's going to be so much better. That pricing does not include on-road costs. So the two-wheel drive 5 might scrape in just below the wholly immoral and entirely unethical but enduring federal luxury car tax threshold, the one for fuel-efficient vehicles, which is roughly about 80 grand this tax year. And you might pay a small amount of luxury car tax on the all-wheel drive. Of course, if you live in brain-dead Vicwegia, you'll also have to cope with the equally immoral but far more Dunning-Kruger road user tax on EVs. Thanks very much, Dan Andrews, for doing your bit to make Australia look like a laughing stock on the world stage, which, let's face it, is actually ScoMo's job. So, demarcation, dude. One can only hope the High Court in Vicwegia rules against the Andrews electric stupid tax. So here's hoping a bunch of men wearing wigs and dresses make exactly the right call on that. It's fun to stay at the YMCA. Yes. And if you're worried about recharging, don't be, dude. Like, if you can find the right pumped-up DC recharger, this thing is internally equipped to set something of a very strong qualifying lap on that. If you find yourself one day out there on the road to Dingo Piss Creek and sucking on a dry tank of electrons, or near enough, and you manage to find yourself a 350 kilowatt charger, that's going to charge you back up from 10% to 80% of full charge in just 18 minutes, which is outstanding. But when you think about that, right, 350 kilowatts of DC electricity, that's about the same as 146 domestic power points, all cranking out the maximum 10 amps. Or another way to look at it is you've just plugged in the power equivalent of two pretty standard 2-litre Atmo petrol engines on a dyno, cranking their hardest at 6,000 RPM. So that's a hell of a lot of electricity. And it does charge this thing up very quickly, which means it's got a killer cooling system built in for the battery, because that's exactly what you need in this situation. And in fact, if you've just got 100 k's to go and you need a quick splash and dash of electrons, 100 k's worth of range at that charging rate is just going to take you 5 minutes, and that's pretty practical. So that's you and a full tank of subatomic particles in no time flat, like little time, whatever. A two-wheel drive IONIQ 5 will crank out 160 kilowatts at the rear wheels, which is faster than it sounds, because electric powertrains make their maximum torque when they're stalled, which would be 350 newton meters at 0 RPM off the mark. That's for the two-wheel drive. 7.4 seconds to 100 is the official time, but that probably means cut snake to about 50 and tapering off somewhat thereafter, especially if it manages to hook up. And on that, one does kind of hope Hyundai wasn't overzealously OCD on the specification of eco tyres for this car, because eco tyres are generally awful to drive on, not unlike driving on ice. And of course, I mean frozen water, not crystal meth, obviously. The all-wheel drive version is slightly down-rated at the rear axle to 155 kilowatts, down from 160. And no, I don't know why. But on the positive side, it does add a separate 70 kilowatt drive system at the front end for a total powertrain output of 225 kilowatts and 605 newton meters. Yes! Again, this should be pretty impressive off the line. More impressive than the 5.2 second 0 to 100 official time suggests, and that's really not that shabby. The range is 451 k's for the two-wheel drive and 430 k's for the all-wheel drive against the WLTP standard test, and the difference there has to be mainly the additional weight of the all-wheel drive system. The base model IONIQ 5 Chitois, as it is not officially known, but everyone in the industry knows what you're talking about when you call it that, that's for sure. It adds about 30 k's of range for a total of about 480-ish k's, which is mainly the weight-saving upside of the poverty pack in a nutshell. The Chitois will not be available until a bit later on. The battery and inverter system has another pretty neat trick up its sleeve too. Like, you don't just put electrons in, okay? It's more of a two-way street than that. You can also decant them and spray subatomic particles here and there externally, which is pretty Jedi when you think about it. Hyundai calls it V2L for vehicle to load, and it's really interesting to me because what you do is you get a special adapter cable and you plug it in here, and at the other end you get normal mains domestic supply, right? Like 240 volt electricity and a maximum of 15 amps, which for the electrically cognizant among you is 3.6 kilowatts. It's a hell of a lot of electricity, in other words. So you can run a whole bunch of appliances on site or during a blackout, like, I don't know, maybe a flat screen television and your computer and a printer and a modem and whatever else, you know, the Ming Moles and all of their appliances. Or you could interrogate an enemy combatant. And if you did that for 12 hours at the maximum 3.6 kilowatts out of the battery down there, even with the baby batteried IONIQ 5, you will still have 25% battery capacity remaining after 12 hours to drive off and get a recharge. And if you buy the big battery baby, then you'll have 44% remaining, and I reckon that is pretty damn versatile. IONIQ 5 is cheaper than a Tesla Model 3 Performance, but not as fast. It's got more warranty, and it is made by a car maker that will not throw you under the bus if there's the merest hint of a problem. So that's different. Still, people don't worship Hyundai like they do electric Jesus, and that's got to be because there can be only one church of electric Scientology. Sadly, though, it's not all electric blowjobs and butterflies with IONIQ 5. No siree. The bad news here is that we're only going to get 400 of them, which is nothing. That's the entire Schittsvillian IONIQ 5 allocation for 2021. A real Lorena Bobbitt proposition right there. Like, just lop it off at 400 and think yourself lucky, dude. Hyundai Schittsville has been tsunamied, if that's a verb, with unprecedented enquiry over this car. The Antipodean outpost looks north, and says, send as many IONIQ 5s as you can make. Soul goes, here's 400, now shut up, Australia. I mean, dude, who does the production planning? We didn't realise it would be this popular. Really? Part of this is because of the ongoing, consistent, demented excellence of our senior executive politicians. Minister for Family Values, Deputy Prime Minister, future Ambassador to France, Le Betrutier, he's part of it, Minister for Cyber Stalking, Minister for the F-35, Range Rover Evoque of fighter jets, and provocative Franco-Schittsvillian fluffer, Peter Potato Head. I blame him in part too, but not as much as Prime Minister for 12th century theology tongue-talking, Minister for vaccine rollout botching, Mensa for ultimate quarantine F-ups and bonus points there, sir. Given the breathtaking size of the fucking moat around the castle, in our case. Mensa for coal and all its virtues, scummo. Yes. Mensa for making scummo look good. That's his main gig, obviously. This is what happens, right? When you don't have an emissions policy because you're too busy friggin' antagonising China and France, and you want to spark off a battle you can't possibly win and maintain consistent upfuckery on all other fronts because re-election. Dumb electorate, Australia, where it's cool to be dumb. Yes. So, we don't get the cool cars. Deal with it. We don't get the cutting edge cars. We don't get the clean cars. We certainly don't get them first, especially when global supply is constrained. We get instead to keep breathing filthy, polluted air in our cities, which kills more people prematurely than car crashes annually. So there's that. Because politicians like this, they don't give a shit about you and me. That's exactly how this rolls. And I'm speaking for more than just myself, I'm sure, when I say I'm a little bit sick of it. Other markets with actual binding air clearing vehicle exhaust regulations, well, they get the clean cars first because, hey, it's still Charles Dickens here and 21st century everywhere else that matters. And that won't change until we get non-clowns in the lodge and cabinet. People prepared to put people first and arsehole corporate political donors and their vested interests, like the coal industry, second. If you're looking for an upside on all of this, if you can secure one of these IONIQ 5s early in the first tranche, you stand a better than even chance of being able to just take delivery and flip it for a lazy $10,000 or something in profit to some poor sap who missed out on this and is kind of jonesing for sparky virtue with the volume on 13 in February or thereabouts. So that could be possible. Bit of a windfall. Also, I note, you won't be buying your IONIQ 5 from a dealer. You'll be buying it, at least the first 400 odd sales, from head office online. The dealers must be so frigging thrilled at that. As I sit here in the fat cave, basking in the majesty, minus my pants, senior executive Hyundai middle managers are still enthusiastically reaching around under the table in the boardroom, deciding which 10 or 11 or 12 dealer principals vegetables will get the official squeeze to deliver your new IONIQ 5. Yes. If you're worried about servicing, therefore, and where you can get that done, I have to say there are 32 so-called Hyundai Blue Drive dealers nationwide, which can handle whatever girlfriend experience of volts and amps is required down the track. They're the ones who've been certified not to burn down the shop when they touch the high voltage wires, basically. Blue Drive. Spare me the ongoing marketing wank. Like, dude, if I ruled the world, things would be different. For example, I'd have a strict no glue sniffing policy in marketing departments everywhere. I mean, like, Hyundai is doing an ace job fracturing its core brand with all these made-up names like N and IONIQ and Genesis and Blue Drive. Where will it end? Could they make it any harder for an ordinary person to understand what they're up to? I don't think they could. Like, they spent a zillion won recently turning the London frigging I into a capital Q to launch IONIQ, mainly because they wanted the world to know how the word ionic ends when you misspell it. Was Hyundai Electric already taken? I give them, look, 9 out of 10 for engineering generally, and 10 out of 10 for customer support. I'm on the record with that, but dudes, 13 out of 10 for own goal kicking on above-the-line external communication. And hey, at least it's entertaining. You can love EVs or hate them, like both allowed, okay? But either way, you have to admit that IONIQ 5 is pretty impressive. And importantly, it's not just an electric powertrain jammed into a pre-existing platform, right? It's a ground-up EV with bespoke engineering from a proper car maker. And when you think about that, over the next few years, this is exactly the kind of thing that's going to upend Tesla. Who is VP of Hyundai Global Design, said, oh shit, sorry, you got to keep the battery cool, and that's a tremendous amount of power going in at that rate. Let's do it again. I want to break free. That was some of my fucking best work just then, incidentally. Yes.